The country does feel, in many respects, like it is in a state of disrepair. What you've described, sometimes literally and directly, is the consequence of us not building things enough. So, the drafty building that you lived in, the expensive energy costs that you were paying, and sometimes they're the indirect costs of that. The long wait for a driving test, something that my friend Ellen Pasternak has actually taken up as a kind of personal campaign to try to fix. And
Mm,
obviously, that isn't caused
good.
by us not building enough stuff directly, but I think it is the consequence of us not having enough money to either direct to the service, or more likely, I actually am a bit skeptical that the problems that the UK has in terms of public services are just a problem of not enough money. I think that they're often a problem of them being run in a very bad way and it being very difficult to reform them if you don't have money to go around. One of the big lessons, I think, of the 1980s, which I actually think were quite successful in terms of liberalizations and reforms, were that it's easier to reform things when you can grease the wheel of reform with either de facto bribes to certain groups that would otherwise oppose what you want to do, or by just setting up new things and diverting some resources, extra resources to those new things. And so the one of the real, I would say, the story of the UK over the last not just 2 or 3 years since COVID, but of the last kind of 16 years or even more since the mid 2000s is that productivity has flatlined. And productivity is a measure of how much you're producing divided by how much time you're working. So, you can get richer, and to some extent, we have gotten richer by more people joining the labor force, more people getting jobs, or by people working longer hours. But really, you want to get richer by producing more stuff, by being more productive with the time you work. Just adding more hours to your workday isn't a very pleasant way of making more money. It's kind of quite an unpleasant way of making more money. And one of the reasons that we want to be rich is so that we can spend more time with our families and spend more time on vacation and things like that. And the UK really has just flatlined according to this measure of how productive we are. And had we continued growing at the rate that we were growing before, we say 2008, but I think that you could kind of take any year in the mid 2000s as your break point. We would be about 25% richer in the UK, which would translate into an average family being about £8,000 a year better off. And that's obviously huge. That's a huge amount of money for families that are, at the moment earning maybe 33k. That's a really, really big amount of money to have, if we're right, been left on the table. And so this sense of malaise that you have, that I think everybody feels in the UK, and I'm in London, you're talking about London. London is by far the most prosperous place in the UK. Lots of the rest of the country is in an even worse state than London is. Um, I think is most directly explainable by the fact that we're not able to build the things that we need. So houses are the biggest one, and I'm a huge believer in what I call the housing theory of everything. That not building enough houses causes loads of other problems, but I think also in other parts of the country, it's probably not the case that Sheffield or Birmingham need a lot more houses. Houses are already quite cheap there. But they do need better infrastructure. They do need it to be easier to drive from point to point, and for people to be able to get rail connections from point to point, so that they can get better jobs. And then in other parts of the country, and both for households and especially for industry, energy prices are so high. The UK has the most expensive industrial energy prices in the world, and those energy prices are so high because we just haven't built the energy supply that we need. I think mostly nuclear. And we have decommissioned a lot of the old fossil fuel generation at the same time. For good reason, because we're worried about climate change, but we haven't built any of the things, or we haven't built nearly enough of the stuff to take up the slack. And so it's left the UK in this position where we're flatlining economically. We have very high energy costs, we have very high housing costs, and many parts of the country are totally left behind economically because they can't kind of plug into areas of higher growth. And that's the kind of core of the argument that I and Ben and Samuel have been making.
Mm. So let's start with the energy. What went wrong? So back in the 70s, wasn't the UK? I might say we a few times when I'm referring to the UK, even though I've had the most geographically confused in terms of ethnicity, nationality, and geographical location. I've had the most confusing life. But I just
Well, that kind
claim
of makes two of
everywhere.
us. I'm an Irishman. I'm an adoptive Briton. Um, what went wrong? Well, in up until the 60s, things were looking pretty good from an energy point of view for the UK. Historically, the rise of the British Empire was driven by energy. I don't actually believe that coal caused the Industrial Revolution, but it certainly enabled the Industrial Revolution. And you can go even further earlier on, before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the UK, as it was at that time, England or kind of Britain, um, was producing far more energy per person than other economies in Europe, including really leading ones like France. And we describe, based on the work by Anton Howes, Britain, England, as the world's first energy superpower. And it was this ability to first harvest energy from wood and then harvest energy from coal and other kind of fossil fuels eventually that sort of powered Britain's rise in the 18th and 19th centuries. And then even after the Second World War, and after the Second World War is where things begin to go quite badly for the UK in many ways. But actually, for a few decades, we were doing really well on nuclear power, which was the kind of energy source of the future. As late as 1965, Britain had more nuclear reactors than the rest of the world put together. So, we had 21 nuclear reactors in 1925. The US had 12. The USSR had 3. We had the first nuclear reactor in the world as well. And then a series of mistakes and a series of, I would say, fairly short-sighted decisions. Gas in the North Sea meant that gas was a much cheaper energy source. After the oil crisis in the 1970s, France made a big play and a big bet on nuclear, whereas we didn't. Nuclear sort of fell away. And then this problem of not building enough began to be compounded by fears about nuclear's safety, which led to it becoming very difficult and very expensive to build a nuclear power plant. And this effect has been around the world. It's not just the UK. Every country, really, with a few exceptions in East Asia, has made it incredibly costly, incredibly slow, and incredibly difficult to build nuclear power. So nuclear is now one of the most expensive forms of energy, even though it used to be one of the cheapest. So that's one part of the puzzle. Nuclear, which I think has a lot in its favor, has not really been something that we have taken seriously or tried to keep cheap for the last few decades. And then the other part of the puzzle is, as I mentioned, decarbonization, which I think is important and I think is worth doing. And I think that we, as part of the world, should be interested in reducing our carbon emissions. However, the UK has made, I think, two really important errors in the way it approaches decarbonization, or maybe even three. One is we've tried to lead the world. We've tried to be the best in the world at reducing our carbon emissions. And that's meant that we've rushed into things that other countries haven't rushed into. So, we've tried to cut our carbon emissions faster than any other developed country in the world. And in some ways, that's quite impressive. But in other ways, I think we've driven the cost of energy up very high, because the way we've done that has been, number one, to decommission a lot of coal and gas power plants way before other countries have. Germany is using brown coal, which is a really, really bad form of coal, lignite. The Germans are very much not concerned about decarbonization, despite kind of claiming to be. The Americans are obviously using oil and gas, and to some extent coal. So we've decommissioned a lot of the cheap fossil fuel generators. And at the same time, rather than trying to use nuclear to pick up the slack in terms of electricity generation, we've turned to wind and solar, especially wind. And although I don't think wind and solar are completely terrible, and in some parts of the world, I think solar especially has a lot of promise, probably in Australia, probably in the southwest of the US, probably in southern Europe and North Africa and other sunny places. Solar is obviously just not very well suited to the UK. It's a dark country. It's the morning here when we're recording, and the sky is completely overcast. And I'm sure if I log on to the energy dashboard, which is a sort of live dashboard of where our electricity is coming from at the moment, I'm sure solar will be almost no generation at all, assuming the rest of the country is as overcast as it is here in London. And wind is really, really limited as a way of generating electricity because it's intermittent, like solar. It only produces electricity when the wind is blowing. It's actually very expensive because although we think of wind as being something where, okay, you build it once, you have an upfront cost, and then it's sort of free, and the same is true for solar. Actually, there are loads of costs associated with wind, especially that are often ignored when we talk about the cost of these generation forms. One is the cost of building the grid. And we don't need to get too deep into this, but the cost of building the electricity grid around wind and solar is very, very high because of where wind needs to go, because we have to build a lot of extra grid connections, we have to overbuild. Then there's the cost of keeping the grid in balance because, minute to minute, you need the electricity system to be in balance. You can't have more electricity going in than people are using, and you can't have less electricity than people are using. And it's quite expensive to balance that when your generation is so unpredictable from minute to minute as wind is. And then from day to day and from week to week, because as we've mentioned, wind is intermittent, we need backup generation. So we need a whole other way of producing electricity, which is gas, and that costs money as well. And our argument is that these costs are usually ignored, but they're put onto the cost of bills in the UK. And our argument is that the reason that electricity costs have risen as much as they have, and just for context, electricity prices for industrial users have more than doubled in the last 20 years in inflation-adjusted terms. I mean, that's absolutely gigantic, is because we're not producing fossil fuel generation the way we used to. We're relying on very expensive wind and solar, mostly wind. I don't want to kind of blame solar too much because it's a tiny share of the UK's generation for obvious reasons. And we haven't done the things that we ought to do to make nuclear cheap. And the reason that one should be optimistic here is that while the limitations of wind power are pretty inherent to wind power, they're only really solvable if we make gigantic improvements in battery technology, which may happen eventually, but are not going to happen in the next 6 months or the next 12 months, or certainly haven't happened yet. Nuclear's costs are expensive because we have chosen for them to be expensive. We have made a decision regulatorily for nuclear to be expensive to build, and we can change that. And so, the message, or the reason that I'm optimistic about the UK, is that most of the problems we have are self-inflicted and are fixable because they're problems to do with bad regulation and bad rules and bad administration, rather than anything inherent to the